The throne room was built to inspire awe. Marble pillars rose like silent giants, etched with patterns of gold that caught the torchlight and shimmered like fire trapped in stone. The floor was polished to such a sheen that the reflections of the courtiers looked ghostly, as if the dead themselves stood in attendance. And at the center of it all, elevated upon a throne carved from obsidian and crowned with ivory lions, sat the queen. She was not old, nor was she the youthful bride many kings sought to parade. Her beauty was not the fleeting blossom of spring, but the mature flame of summer, radiant, commanding, dangerous. Her hair, black as a raven's wing, fell in waves down her shoulders, and her eyes carried that peculiar weight of someone who both ruled and suffered. The people who entered her court bowed deeply, afraid to meet her gaze. For behind that gaze lay something more than royal authority. It was hunger. Not for food, not for gold, but something unspoken, something dangerous. The queen had everything a mortal could desire. Silk garments embroidered with gems from the east, perfumes distilled from flowers that bloomed only once a year, and a palace where fountains never ceased to sing. Yet despite all this, she was alone. Her husband, the late king, had died suddenly years ago. Some whispered of poison, others of a curse, though no one dared to say such things aloud. Since then, she had ruled in her own right, a rare and unsettling thing in a world where men claimed dominion. But even as she commanded armies and dictated laws, the chambers of her heart remained cold, her nights unbearably silent. And then came the guards. They stood at the edges of her throne room, young men chosen not only for their strength, but for their beauty. Sun-browned skin, broad shoulders, swords gleaming at their hips. Their eyes never left her figure, though they pretended otherwise. At first she paid no attention. They were tools, no different from the spear or the shield. But slowly, something shifted. Perhaps it was one night, after a council session that left her weary, when she saw one of them staring longer than he should have. Perhaps it was the faint smile of another when he helped her down the palace steps. And perhaps, deep within herself, the queen welcomed it. For what is power without intimacy? What is glory without the warmth of human touch? The courtiers began to notice subtle changes, her gaze lingering longer on her guards than was seemly, the way her hand brushed too close to the hilt of one's sword as she passed. The faint curve of her lips, too soft, too private, for a sovereign meant to be made of iron. They whispered among themselves, "Does she long for them? Has the queen's heart been captured by her own soldiers?" No one dared say it aloud in her presence, but the palace walls had ears, and in those shadows, the seeds of rumor had already been planted. The palace was alive at night in ways most never imagined. By day, it gleamed with ceremony, processions of dignitaries, echoes of proclamations, and the weight of judgment spoken from the throne. But by night, when the torches burned lower and the corridors filled with shadows, the palace became something else, a place of whispers, secrets, and unseen footsteps. Servants carried trays of wine across marble floors, their sandals hushed as they hurried. Musicians, dismissed from the day's court, strummed quiet notes in hidden alcoves. And above them all, behind towering doors carved with golden lions, the queen's private chambers glowed faintly from within. It was here that the rumors began to take shape. A handmaiden had sworn she saw a guard leave those chambers long after the hour when no business was conducted. Another claimed she heard laughter, soft, forbidden laughter, that could not have been meant for any counselor or minister. These whispers floated like smoke from torch to torch, curling through the halls, growing thicker with every retelling. The queen herself seemed unaware, or perhaps she was too aware. She grew more radiant as the days passed, her eyes carrying a spark not seen in years. When she addressed her court, her voice held a hidden softness, as though she carried some secret warmth within her. But those who watched closely noticed how often her gaze wandered to the guards, lingering, daring, almost taunting. One night, the truth revealed itself. A storm raged outside the palace walls, rain lashing against stone, thunder splitting the sky. Within the queen's chamber, firelight flickered across silken curtains. The sound of armored footsteps approached, not in the crisp formation of duty, but slow, hesitant, carrying the weight of choice. The queen sat by the window, her robe of crimson silk gathered loosely around her. When the guard entered, closing the heavy door behind him, their eyes met, and in that silence, centuries of decorum shattered. No record would ever detail what transpired in those hidden hours. Chroniclers could only guess, and servants could only speculate. But by morning, when the storm had passed, the guard left her chambers with his head lowered, and the queen appeared in court with a faint smile upon her lips. It should have ended there. A secret indulgence, a fleeting moment lost in time. But secrets have a way of breeding, of multiplying in the dark. Soon, it was not one guard, but two, then more. The queen, once untouchable, was now bound by desire, and the palace, once ruled by awe, now hummed with whispers of scandal. The queen lies with her guards, they murmured in kitchens and corridors. She has broken the sacred laws of kings and gods alike, and in those whispers lay the beginnings of her undoing. Every palace is built on stone, but it survives on silence, and silence was crumbling within these walls. The queen's indulgences had become harder to conceal. At first it had been a single night, easily dismissed as rumor, but indulgence, once tasted, demands repetition. The guards who entered her chambers did not always leave unseen. Their armor clinked, their footsteps echoed, their faces betrayed more than discipline should allow, and there were eyes everywhere. The court ministers, many of them gray-bearded men who had once served her late husband, watched with a mixture of horror and delight. Horror, because the throne was sacred, meant to be untouchable. Delight, because scandal was a weapon. And they had been searching for the queen's weakness for years. One man in particular, the chancellor, sharpened his schemes like a blade. He was a patient figure, tall and narrow as a spear, with a smile that never reached his eyes. He had once sworn loyalty to the throne, but loyalty bends easily when power shifts. The chancellor began placing his pawns. Servants were paid in gold to linger outside the queen's chambers. A maid was ordered to drop a scarf deliberately at the wrong moment, to see what she might glimpse. A guard was questioned, pressed with wine, his tongue loosened until the unspoken truths spilled out. Piece by piece, the whispers turned into evidence. Meanwhile, the queen remained unaware, or perhaps unwilling to care. She had built her life around steel and solitude, and now, for the first time, she felt alive. Her laughter echoed louder in the halls, her touch grew bolder, her gaze lingered openly on the men who served her. But the danger was closing in. One evening, as she walked through the torch-lit hall, her cloak trailing behind her, she caught sight of a servant who did not lower his eyes. Instead, he stared, and in that stare was something chilling, knowledge. It unsettled her. That night, alone by her window, the queen asked herself the question that had begun to creep into her mind like a shadow. What if they know? But the answer did not come. Instead, another guard entered her chamber, and once more she surrendered to her hunger, silencing the fear with desire. What she did not know was that the chancellor's spies were waiting in the dark, counting every moment, every whisper, every betrayal of the crown. And soon, her passion would no longer be her secret. It would be her noose. Rumors are smoke, harmless, fleeting. But in the chancellor's hands, smoke became fire. He knew the court. He knew the nobles' hunger for scandal, their jealousy of the queen's beauty, and their bitterness at her power. All he had to do was feed them small sparks until they burned with outrage. At a banquet, he let his tongue slip by accident. A subtle joke about guards who looked too proud, too well fed. A sly remark about how the queen's nights were longer than her days. Every word landed like poison, infecting the room. The nobles chuckled, pretending not to believe. But in their eyes, The Chancellor saw it, the hunger for more. Meanwhile, the Queen's world grew narrower. She began noticing how courtiers fell silent when she entered the hall, how whispers swelled just behind her back, how the guards she favored shifted nervously when their comrades stared too long. But still, she defied them. Desire was not something she could cage. She told herself she was queen, above their judgment, untouchable. The Chancellor smiled at her arrogance. He had seen it before, in kings and generals who thought themselves immortal. It always ended the same. So he made his move. Late one night, he bribed a guard, one who had never been summoned by the Queen. This guard was bitter, resentful, his pride wounded by her neglect. For a bag of silver, he agreed to what the Chancellor asked. He positioned himself outside the Queen's chamber, waiting. The door opened. He heard the sound of armor being removed, of low laughter, of voices that should never have been heard in those sacred rooms. And then he struck. He flung open the door, torchlight flooding the chamber. Inside, the Queen froze, her royal robe half slipped from her shoulder, her hand resting on the chest of her chosen guard. The silence was louder than any scream. The spy did not linger. He bowed mockingly, turned, and ran through the halls, shouting words that would shatter the throne. The Queen betrays the crown. The Queen lies with her guards. By dawn, the palace was alive with chaos. Ministers demanded explanations. Priests declared omens of doom. Guards whispered whether their loyalty lay with the throne, or the scandal that had infected it. And through it all, the Chancellor stood silent, his hands folded, his eyes gleaming with triumph. For the Queen's secret was no longer a secret. It was a weapon. Scandal spreads faster than fire. By morning, the entire kingdom whispered of it. From the marketplace to the temple steps, voices rose in disbelief and glee. The Queen, with her guards. To some, it was a sin. To others, a joke. But to all, it was a story too irresistible to ignore. The Queen, however, was not one to bow to whispers. She was a woman forged in storms, and if her enemies thought scandal would break her, they had forgotten who she was. When the council gathered that day, the chamber was heavy with judgment. The Chancellor stood among them, silent, letting the nobles' outrage echo through the hall. They demanded answers, penance, perhaps even abdication. And then, the Queen entered. She did not crawl, she did not beg. She wore a gown of black silk, her crown shining, her gaze sharp as steel. "Do you think me so weak," she said, her voice carrying across the chamber, "that a rumor can topple a throne?" Her words silenced the room. She rose to her full height, every inch the sovereign. "Yes, I have allowed guards into my chambers," she continued, "but not as lovers, as witnesses, for I suspected treachery among you. Whispers, schemes, plots to destroy me, and now I see I was right." It was a dangerous lie, but a clever one. She cast suspicion back upon them, turning her shame into a trap. Suddenly, ministers glanced nervously at one another. Who would be accused next? The Chancellor watched, impressed, but not fooled. He knew her game. Still, even he had to admit, the Queen fought like a cornered lioness. To strengthen her position, she summoned loyal priests and proclaimed a ritual cleansing, declaring the scandal a test of the gods. She paraded herself through the temple in white robes, offering sacrifices under the gaze of the people. Some believed her, others did not. But doubt was enough to buy her time, and time was all she needed. Or so she thought. Because even as she fought back with fire, the Chancellor was already plotting his next move. And this time, he would not rely on whispers. He would draw blood. The Queen believed she had bought herself time. Her speech in the council chamber had shaken her enemies. Her ritual cleansing had silenced the priests, and for a brief moment, she felt the throne steady beneath her. But trust, once broken, is like shattered glass, impossible to piece back together. Among her guards, unease grew. Some still adored her, bound by loyalty and desire. Others whispered in the shadows, fearing her downfall would drag them down with her. A single rumor was dangerous, but now suspicion could kill. The Chancellor knew this well. He did not need to invent lies anymore. He simply needed to feed the fear already spreading. Quietly, he slipped gold into the hands of certain guards, whispering promises of pardon and power if they turned against her. And so, the Queen's fortress became her cage. One night, as the palace lay silent beneath the moon, she awoke with a start. A sound, too soft for ordinary ears, but not for hers. The scrape of steel, the shuffle of feet. Her hand darted beneath her pillow. The dagger was still there, cold, heavy. She rose from her bed, moving like a shadow. Outside her chamber door, she heard them, her own guards, murmuring, debating whether to strike tonight or wait for the Chancellor's signal. Her blood ran cold. The betrayal she had feared was no longer rumor. It was here. For the first time, the Queen felt not anger, but something far more dangerous. Clarity. If her lovers could become her killers, then she would not wait for the knife to fall. She would strike first. She summoned those she still trusted, just 3 guards, men who had sworn their lives to her long before scandal tainted her name. Together, they devised a plan, a silent purge of the traitors, swift and merciless. But in the world of daggers and whispers, even the most careful plan can unravel. And as the Queen prepared to take back control, she did not realize the Chancellor was already one step ahead. The palace at night was a labyrinth of shadows, its torches burning low, its halls echoing with silence. The Queen moved like a phantom, her cloak drawn tight, her eyes colder than the marble statues that lined the corridors. At her side were the 3 guards she still trusted, the last men untouched by the Chancellor's poison. They had sworn their loyalty not for pleasure, but for something far greater, devotion to her crown, and to the woman they believed was destined to rule. Her command to them had been simple, no trial, no hesitation. "Tonight," she whispered, "the traitors sleep their last sleep." And so, the purge began. The first guard to fall was one who had once kissed her hand in devotion. He never woke as her loyal blade slid across his throat. The Queen did not flinch. Compassion had no place in survival. The second was dragged from his bed, begging forgiveness, swearing he was no traitor. His cries were muffled by steel and silence. By dawn, his voice would be forgotten. One by one, the men who had once been her comfort, her secret joy, were erased in the black hours of the night. Their blood pooled in hidden corners, soaking into the stones of the palace like offerings to the gods. But for every traitor slain, another shadow seemed to rise in their place. The Chancellor's influence was not confined to soldiers. It stretched into servants, scribes, even the priesthood. By the time the Queen returned to her chamber, her dagger slick with blood, she knew the truth. She had not destroyed the conspiracy. She had only declared war upon it. And worse, she had left a trail. The purge was too loud, too swift. By morning, the palace would reek of death, and the Chancellor would use it as proof of her madness. When the Queen lay down upon her bed, her heart still racing from the killings, she knew she had crossed a threshold. There was no return now. From this night forward, she was no longer the Queen who loved. She was the Queen who killed. The morning sun rose crimson, as if the heavens themselves bore witness to the blood spilled in the night. Within the palace walls, whispers had already spread like wildfire. The Queen had killed her own guards. The Chancellor seized the moment with predatory precision. He did not shout, nor did he rage. Instead, he gathered the council, the scribes, and the priests. His voice, calm and measured, carried a venom more lethal than any blade. "Is this the rule of a just sovereign?" he asked, his tone dripping with false sorrow. "Or is this the descent of a woman ruled by lust and paranoia?" Every word was a dagger aimed at the Queen's throne. He painted her as a seductress unfit to rule, a widow turned mad by her own insatiable hunger. The blood of her lovers, he claimed, stained not only her hands, but the sanctity of the crown itself. And the people believed him, or at least enough of them did. Outside the palace gates, the markets filled with murmurs. The story was told and retold. The queen who had betrayed her king, the queen who seduced her gods, the queen who killed them when they turned away from her bed. Inside her chamber, the queen listened to the echoes of betrayal creeping closer. Her loyal guards warned her that the chancellor was summoning allies, that even now a silent army of whispers gathered against her. But the queen was no stranger to danger. If the chancellor played a game of words, she would answer with power. That very night she appeared before the court, draped in crimson silk, her crown gleaming beneath the torchlight. Her beauty was a weapon, her silence a blade sharper than any steel. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, cold, and commanding. Yes, I have killed, and I will kill again, if betrayal dares to crawl into my house. I am your queen, not your prey. The court fell into uneasy silence. Some bowed in awe. Others trembled in fear. But the chancellor smiled. He had drawn her into the open, and now the war was no longer hidden in shadows. It was a battle for the soul of the kingdom. And in that battle, there could be only one survivor. The queen had always known that love was fragile, but she had not expected loyalty to be just as fleeting. The chancellor's poison spread deeper than she imagined. It did not stop at the council or the priests. It seeped into the very men who still stood guard outside her chamber, the last survivors of her secret nights, the ones she had spared during the purge. For weeks, they had sworn their undying devotion. They had protected her bed, her throne, her very life. Yet as whispers of the chancellor's promises grew louder, gold, titles, land, and the chance to erase their own guilt, cracks began to form in the brotherhood of her guards. One night, as the queen prepared for a council meeting, she noticed it. The silence of her protectors was too heavy, their eyes avoiding hers, their blades resting too close at hand. The air felt different, charged with the weight of betrayal. She dismissed them with a wave of her hand, but her heart raced. Behind the closed doors of her chamber, she realized the truth. They were no longer her lovers. They were executioners waiting for the right command. The chancellor had succeeded. That night, the queen dreamed of fire, of her throne engulfed in flames, of faceless men dragging her through the halls, of the sound of chains and jeering voices. She woke drenched in sweat, only to find her guards still standing outside, silent as tombstones. But the dream was a warning. The queen knew the brotherhood was finished. The men she once trusted, the ones who had sworn their lives to her in moments of intimacy, now belonged to another master. It was only a matter of time before the knives that once defended her would turn against her flesh. And so, for the first time, the queen tasted the loneliness of true power. Surrounded by guards, she had never been more unguarded. The palace was quiet when the end began. The queen sat alone in her chamber, the golden light of dawn seeping through the lattice windows. She had not slept. Every flicker of torchlight in the halls felt like a shadow moving closer, every clang of armor an omen. When the doors opened, it was not the chancellor who entered, but her own guards. Men she had once embraced, men who had sworn their hearts to her, men who now carried chains. Their faces were stone, their eyes hollow. The bond of flesh and secret oaths had withered into silence. They did not speak as they seized her, their grip unshaking, as though all tenderness had been erased by fear, bribes, or promises of absolution. The queen did not resist. She walked with regal steps through the corridors where she had once ruled in pleasure and power. Now, the very courtiers who had smiled at her glory turned their eyes away, unwilling to meet her gaze. In the throne room, the chancellor awaited, draped in crimson robes, his lips curled in triumph. He had no need for trial, no need for judgment. The verdict had already been whispered in every corner of the kingdom. The queen had betrayed her crown with the bodies of her own guards. The punishment was to be an example, On the steps of the temple, before the eyes of her people, she was stripped of her crown. Chains weighed on her wrists as priests declared her sins aloud, each word echoing against the stone like a hammer striking her name from history. Her lovers, the guards, were nowhere to be seen. Perhaps they had fled with their rewards, or perhaps they too had met silent ends. The queen raised her head high, refusing to bow. Even as the crowd gasped, even as the sentence was pronounced, her eyes held the same fire that had once lured men into ruin. When the blade fell, silence swallowed the square. But in that silence, a story was born. Whispers spread across taverns and temples, of a queen who had dared to love as she pleased, who had ruled not only with her crown, but with her desires. They said her ghost still wandered the palace halls, seeking the guards who had betrayed her, her shadow draped in silken veils, her voice a siren's call in the dark. The chancellor had destroyed her body. But her legend, dangerous, forbidden, and intoxicating, outlived him. For generations to come, people would remember her not as a sinner, but as a queen who defied the chains of her own throne. And in that memory, she won the only kind of immortality a mortal could claim.